Hello, hello. Welcome back to the second part of social psychology. Um, Hopefully, by now, you've already noticed that it is a very interesting and exciting chapter. Although the sound and tone of my voice right now may not actually convey just how exciting it is. So, I will try and, you know, inject a little life into it. In this edition, we're going to be talking about things like prejudice and groupthink and stuff like that. So it's not nearly as exciting as the first half with all of those really cool studies, but um, it is, you know, entertaining nonetheless. So we're going to start this chapter or this portion of the chapter off by talking about um, where we left off with obedience and um, with conformity and role playing and foot in the door phenomenon. And we're going to sort of move ahead to um, not just the fact that we are that we like to imitate each other or we like to reduce our cognitive dissonance or things like that. But a researcher named Triplett brought this idea called social facilitation to the table. And social facilitation is a very interesting concept. As you can see from the slide, it says that, it's defined as the presence of other people arouses people, improving performance on easy or well-learned tasks, but decreasing it on difficult ones. So what does that mean? Well, think about if you were working and your boss wasn't around. Maybe you were futzing around on social media, checking out the Instagram and all of those things. But if you knew that your boss was watching you, guess who would be click, 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 clack, 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 typing away at their computer, right? If it's something that you already know how to do, just the fact that somebody else is around, you do it better. Well, um, we could think of things like when I used to go and, practice shooting hoops and playing basketball back when I was able to. And, let's just say that your crush or somebody that you like is around and, you don't want to make it look like you just are shooting to shoot. So maybe your performance improves because, hey, um, it's, uh, it's somebody that's there. It's your crush. You can't look like you're dogging it, right? So, the problem with that is it's exactly the opposite idea for something you're not good at. So let's say that you're not that great a singer, but you want to do some karaoke, and then all of a sudden you notice that crush is, oh, that crush is at the karaoke place that you're karaokeing, and well, now you're really nervous, and um, since it's a difficult task for you, you really, really kind of screw that up. That's this idea called social facilitation, that your performance is either increased or decreased, depending on if it's easy and well known and well learned, or if it's something that you're not too familiar with. So again, performance can also be hindered because, most likely, but not necessarily the correct response occurs. Now, when we talk about social facilitation in the good way, one of the things that we talk about is how if you're really good at your performance, you seem to be picked up by the presence of others. And we see this a lot in basketball or in sports in general. I don't know why basketball came to my head. I was actually thinking football, but I said basketball because I was using it as an example just a minute ago. Well, we have this thing called the hometown advantage or home team advantage. And even in betting, if the teams are pretty equal, the home team gets a 3-point advantage in football simply because they're playing at home. Now, that may mean that they're in the comforts of their own houses, that they don't have to travel to a different time zone or anything like that. But really, the advantage to this is in social facilitation. It means that the crowd is going to be behind you. They're going to be quiet when you're on offense, your hometown team, and they're going to be really loud when the other team is on offense. So it's hard for them to hear. Um, Obviously, you would think since athletes practice pretty much every day that the tasks are well learned. So they seem to perform better to a crowd that's really receptive to them, right? In fact, in Seattle, the Seahawks when they play, their crowd is called the 12th man. And if you didn't know that reference, it's because in football, it's 11 on 11 on the field. So the crowd being behind them, they call the crowd the 12th man. And that's a perfect example for social facilitation. So going back to this idea of Milgram and his obedience, what Milgram found in these experiments, and I would imagine that you've already watched the video. If not, you can go back and watch it. But that obedience was highest when the person giving orders was nearby, was perceived as a legitimate authority figure. This is a repeat slide from the last time, so I'm just refreshing your memory. That the research was supported by a prestigious institution like Yale. The victim was at a distance or depersonalized. You could hear them, but you couldn't actually see them, right? And in fact, it was a recording, as the video revealed. And that there were no role models for defiance. So two of the things, right, or two things that Ash's conformity experiment and Milgram's obedience experiment had in common was that in the presence, if there was another person there, in both obedience and conformity, it would bring down that level if you just had one person sort of on your side. And the good thing about Milgram's experiment is they did not. If they had a condition where there was somebody there saying, hey, I don't think this is a good idea, I bet there would be a lot less than 65% of people that went all the way to XXX. So that's just a little memory refresher from the last one. And if you're playing these back to back, then I guess you don't really need the refresher. But not everybody is, so there. So this idea of the home team advantage, when others observe us, again, we performed well-learned tasks more quickly and accurately. So the crowd hypes you up. You're good at what you do at your sport. Otherwise, you wouldn't be playing in a professional league. And boom, that's where the home team gets their boost. But again, if the task is new or difficult and you've got people there that are watching you, especially ones that you know, then your performance is most likely going to be less quick, less accurate, and it's going to be decreased. So, yeah. The other thing with social influence that people really sort of lose their ability to do math is this idea called social loafing. So, you know, in Psych 1, we had a few weeks together and we got to do sort of a group, a bit of group activities. My research methods class was supposed to have group projects, but there's always a matter of uncertainty when people are in a group, because more often than not, students come up to professors and say, you know, so and so didn't pull their weight, and we really had to pick up his or her, you know, slack and things like that. And the question is, why do people think, or why do people tend to not give 100% effort when they're in a group? So here you see on the left, it says working hard or hardly working. In group projects like Earth Day, beach cleanup, social loafing often occurs because when you're working out there, you think, well, everybody else is doing their part. So, you know, if I chip in and give 100%, then we're not going to have that much to pick up. So I better not pick up as much so that they also have, you know, enough to do. So this idea of social loafing is defined as the tendency for people in a group to exert, and I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this, less effort when you pool your efforts together toward attaining a common goal than when they're individually accountable. And again, I tell you it's a math problem, right? Well, what do you mean, professor? Well, I'll tell you what I mean. When you are doing an assignment by yourself, you are responsible for 100% of that assignment, right? And sometimes not everybody gives 100%, but I'm just saying. Not you guys, of course. But when you're in a group, you know, everybody, if there's 4 people in a group, the idea that people are doing the math wrong is that, oh, well, everybody's responsible for 25%. So I really only need to give 25% of the effort. That is the wrong way of thinking and the wrong way of executing. See, the problem is if you split things into 4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, and 1/4, so each person has an equal share. The problem is each person has to do 100% of what they were given. If you only do 25% of your 25%, then you bring everybody else down, right? So why do people do this? Well, they feel like when they act as part of a group, they're less individually accountable. It's almost as if their individual contribution doesn't matter as much as it would if they were doing the whole thing themselves. And a lot of times that's where they're sort of taking advantage when there's a lack of identification in the group. So we're about to get into another sort of area where people sort of lose their individuality when they're doing group work or there's a group mentality, and they just become sort of part of that group. So this is where I normally tell the story of where I used to work at the Playboy Mansion. And um, when I was working parties, I was a shift leader, so I was in charge of some of the other guys that were out there. And a lot of times we'd find people out by the soda machine in the back just hanging out. And I ask you, what are you guys doing? And kind of like this picture on the left, they're like, look, everybody else is out there at this party picking up cups and plates and all of this stuff. And so if we go out there, they're not going to have as much to clean up. And I said, because you're back here, they have more to clean up and they're busting their butts and doing more than their share. You're doing less than your share. So if you don't want to be fired, it might be a good idea to stop drinking the soda and get back out there and helping, right? Because I'm sorry, I don't buy it. But it's human nature for some people to feel that way because of this idea of social loafing. So the biggest takeaway from this is they are acting as part of the group, so they're feeling less accountable and less individual. When you lose your individuality and you kind of just become one of the group, that can have a big effect on your behavior and your effort. So, when you're in a crowd, when you're part of a group, yes, in basketball, in sports, in very many ways, in business, being part of a team and being sort of a cog in the machine is a good thing if you're doing your part. But the problem with group mentality is sometimes you lose your individuality. You lose your sense of who you are. And this is something we call de-individuation. And if you guys watched the Zimbrano video on the Stanford prison experiment, he uses the word de-individuation in that video. And this idea of de-individuation involves a loss of your self-awareness and self-restraint, which usually occurs in group situations that foster around arousal, so everybody is sort of emotionally charged, and anonymity. Nobody has a name tag that they're referred to. In the Stanford prison experiment, right? So it thrives in many different settings. Let's go back to the idea of the Stanford prison experiment. They were playing the role that they were given. The prisoners were even given prison numbers instead of their names. So it was no longer Jim or Bob or Tony. It was prisoner 3259. When you lose your name, you lose some of that self-awareness and self-restraint. And some of those prisoners went a little crazy. Some of those officers got a little power hungry, and they lost themselves in their role. They lost themselves in a group effort of good guys versus bad guys, of right prisoners versus cops. So we see this in the roles that people play when you're part of an organization, if you're part of a group, if you're part of a mob. So this brings us to another sort of situation. One of the things when we talk about group mentality, mob mentality, people sort of losing themselves in de-individuation, we think of riots. A lot of times when people are upset about something. In 2011 in England, there were riots. Lots of looting, meaning stealing things, breaking windows, and just taking whatever they want. And rioters were what we call disinhibited by social arousal. Now, I used this word disinhibited before when we talked about alcohol and its effects, right? So inhibition is your inner voice telling you, maybe I don't want to sing karaoke because I'm not that good, or maybe I shouldn't do this because it's against the law. Well, this idea of social arousal, people being socially, everybody else running and rushing towards something, emotional arousal, so your emotions are going crazy, and anonymity, right? You're just part of the group. You're not yourself. You're just part of this rushing, crazy mob of looters and rioters. And the fact this was compounded in 2011 by the fact that they were wearing black hoods, black masks, covering their faces, becoming less. We'll get to the mask thing, for what's going on currently later. But in this case, they really lost themselves. They really were de-individualized, right? That was a lot of de-individuation. And then later, it wasn't until later when their masks were off and they were sat down, some of the ones that got arrested, they expressed bewilderment over their own behavior. Like, I didn't even know I was capable of doing that. In the Milgram experiment, most of these people were just regular citizens, yet 2/3 of them went all the way to enough voltage to potentially kill a man. We see this in, a lot of people that didn't feel like they were capable of it. This goes all the way back to the Nazi example, right? A lot of um, the whole reason for Milgram's experiment was Nazis that were interviewed years later said, I didn't kill anybody. I was just following orders. I wouldn't be able to do that, right? Bewilderment over their own behavior or the things, like that. It reminds me of Los Angeles in 1992. Um, wow, that was almost 30 years ago. There was a case of the Rodney King riots. And if you guys don't know, I'm sure you learned about them in history class, but um, one of the first times that there was videotape evidence, no, not cell phone, an actual like old school's JVC over the shoulder video camera, home video camera, recorded 4 white police officers from the LAPD pulling over an African American man who may have been speeding a little bit and didn't really want to get out of his car because he didn't feel he did anything wrong. But once they pulled him out, once he got out, they started beating on him and using what we call excessive force with their sticks and batons and everything. And so the African American community was like, okay, now we have visual evidence that they were discriminating and using excessive force. And a mostly white jury said that the cops were not guilty, that they didn't abuse their power. And the black community was up in arms. This was right here in South Central in Watts, Inglewood, East LA area as well. And they started looting and rioting. They became anonymous. They were part of this group mob mentality. And the biggest head scratcher for me as a 12 13-year-old 12 and a half year old kid was look at what these people are doing. They're not even realizing, they're just breaking stuff, stealing stuff, wanting to burn it down because of the frustration and of the verdict and everything going on. But if they really would have stopped to think about it, they were caught up in this de-individuation. If they really would have thought about it, here's the problem. Whose neighborhoods were they destroying? The answer? Their own. They were destroying South Central, Watts. They were destroying family and community members that were trying to make these neighborhoods thrive. Inglewood was attacking Inglewood. They were attacking their own shops. They weren't going to Beverly Hills and trying to riot on Rodeo Drive. They were destroying their own neighborhoods. And by the time they realized it, it was already too late, right? How could I have been so dumb? How could I have done such a thing? You're not yourself. You're not thinking about it. Your emotions, your automatic brain, and your de-individuation, right? No self-restraint. Your self-identity's gone. And there you go, just marching in because you wanted a new TV. And screw the man. So with these group activities, mob mentalities, we can trace it back to Nazi Germany. We can look at conformity and obedience and all of these things that we've been talking about in this chapter. And let's look what happens when people are part of a group. First of all, especially with the divide we see in this country now, even growing even greater in this last few months, is something that we see called group polarization. And group polarization means that, again, we're not using a central route of persuasion that's going to cause somebody from the other side to see things our way. And we're definitely not going to see things their way, right? So when you have group discussions with people who are the same as you, who have the same ideals, who have the same belief system. Discussions with like-minded others will strengthen prevailing beliefs and attitudes, and it gets people even stronger in that sense. We see this all the time on the internet, right? Internet communication magnifies this effect in both good ways. Social, we talked about the congressional elections and getting more people to vote because they saw their friends that did it, specific ones. And of course, mostly for worse, right? So when we are part of a group, we sort of lose that individuality. And then there's another sort of topic, another definition here called groupthink. Groupthink says that people are driven by a desire for harmony within a decision-making group, and a lot of times they'll override any realistic appraisal of alternatives. In groupthink, the problem is you think you're going along with what the majority wants, and a lot of times they don't. So an example of groupthink, there was a famous, I don't know if it was a paper, wasn't really a study, but there was a guy that wrote in the 1970s that he and his family were sitting outside. It was a really hot day in Texas, and there was, the mom, the dad, the son, the daughter, and they were trying to figure out what to do on such a hot, boring day. And the mom chimes in and says, "Hey, remember that time we went to that restaurant about an hour and a half away? That was pretty good, right?" "Yeah, uh-huh." Family agrees. "Yeah, that was pretty good. Um, does anybody, would anybody want to maybe take a trip and go there? Now, no AC in the car, really hot day. They'd have to, it wouldn't be so much fun to do that." And the dad didn't really want to do it. And the son and the daughter didn't really want to do it. But they thought, well, the rest of the group probably wants to. They didn't ask. They just assumed if mom brought it up, everybody wanted to do it. So everybody said, okay, 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 let's do that. They got in the car, had a miserable drive, went to the restaurant, wasn't even as good as they remembered, and then they had to drive all the way back. When they came back home, he said, why did we do that? I didn't really want to do that. I just thought everybody else did. That's what the dad said. And the son said, well, I said yes because I thought everybody else did. And the daughter said, well, I said yes because I thought everybody else did. And the mom, who came up with the idea, said, I didn't even think it was that good an idea, but everybody else seemed to want to do it. That's the problem with groupthink, is that sometimes you lose your individual power. Person in that family that says, really, I don't think that's the greatest idea. It can sway the majority. So individual power can be greater than you think. Maybe during the riots, if one of the people that was there said, what are we doing? Guys, we're attacking our own neighborhood. Then maybe that some of that, some of them could have snapped out of it and realized, became a little more self-aware, and maybe there wouldn't have been as much damage as there was, right? So looking at this idea of group polarization, this study was done in 1970, but you would have thought it might have been done last year. So looking at a high prejudice group versus a low prejudice group, what the study found was that people who are highly prejudiced, racist, sexist, homophobic, all of those things, if they were talking together amongst themselves in a group, their prejudice that was already high tend to get even higher. So discussions among like-minded people tend to strengthen their pre-existing attitudes. Those that were already prejudiced became more prejudiced. And then we had low prejudice groups that really are accepting of everybody, and doesn't matter your, gender, weight, sexual preference, race, religion, anything like that. Those low prejudice groups that talked amongst each other, talked amongst themselves, actually came out after the discussion less prejudiced than they already weren't, right, in this case. So talking over racial issues increased prejudice in a high school group, in high school students, and decreased prejudice in a low prejudice group. So they were even less prejudiced when they came out of that conversation. The high prejudice group was even more. Does this not sound familiar to you in a setting these days, looking at Democrats and Republicans and all of these beliefs, right? All these people ready to riot and storm the city because they can't, get their hair cut and they've lost their freedom. It's very interesting to look at the world these days, especially the social psychology chapter. This is why it's especially important right now. So in the blogosphere, we see this on the internet. In blue, those are liberal blogs. You're most likely going to be connected to other liberal blogs. Red would be, of course, conservative blogs, which are going to be linked to a lot of other conservative blogs. So you can think of the blue like MSNBC, the red like Fox News, and only a few in the middle are actually connected, right? So each dot represents a blog, and each dot's size reflects the number of other blogs that link to it. So we see a lot of like-mindedness, a lot of group polarization here. Of course, by connecting and magnifying the inclinations of like-minded people, that same idea of group polarization, we know that the internet can be a really, really very bad place. But there's a lot of good as well, right? Some of those GoFundMes, some of these celebrity-driven appearances and shows and all of this to fundraise for people that are in need. So the internet has a history of being a good place for some things, but also a history of being a very, very bad one. So what we see in this chapter, and sort of a recurring theme throughout, is that although some of this stuff can lead to really good pro behavior, a lot of it can lead the other way, right? So it's not, you have to take the good with the bad. You get a lot of good, but you get a lot of bad in this case. So this brings us to the last major topic, antisocial relations. We talked about automatic attitudes, which prevail, right? Which lead to actions. They are predisposed, prejudged. That's what prejudice means, prejudgment. And it's about these attitudes towards a group. And so I have to point out the difference between like prejudice and discrimination. So that's coming up. Prejudice, again, means prejudgment, and it's defined as an unjustified negative attitude towards some group and its members. And again, with the assignment that I gave you guys to do this implicit test, we all have our own biases. We don't always act on them. Sometimes they're just thoughts. Sometimes they're, little things that can lead to something bigger. So people that are prejudiced, a lot of times it's targeted at different cultural, ethnic, or gender groups, sexual preferences, and things like that. The components of prejudice are your beliefs and your emotions, and it is defined as a predisposition to action. So prejudice is just thinking about something, right? If you're walking down the street and you see somebody who's African American and wearing a hoodie, right, like Trayvon Martin comes to mind, and you think, oh, I might not be safe, or I should, walk the other way. That's prejudice. You're not actually doing it yet. You're just thinking it, and you may be getting scared irrationally, right, or things like that. That's not discrimination. That's prejudice. That's the thought. That's the attitude. That's not the actual action. So looking at the important distinction, prejudice is the negative attitude. Actually walking across the street and going out of your way just to avoid that person, that's a behavior. That's what we call discrimination. So prejudice, being prejudiced, right, and being racist may be two different things. Being discriminatory, that's the actual behavior. That's the action. The thought is prejudice. So I just wanted to make that distinction. So the question is, how prejudiced are people? Again, we all have implicit biases, unconscious biases. We all have preferences of one thing over another, even though we try not to. And sometimes, a lot of times, as we talk about with these riots and de-individuation, when you let your automatic brain take over, and including your emotions, that can get people into a lot of trouble. So the best way that I would propose to try and reduce this amount of bias and stuff that could be looked at as racism or xenophobia or any of those things is to make the unconscious conscious. So before you answer automatically, before you let that negative thought or belief turn into a discriminatory action, think about it. Be able to take a step back and think about it before you act or say anything that might be incriminating, right? We know that explicit conscious prejudice in North America has decreased over time. We no longer have lynchings. We allow interracial marriage, right? We have support for all forms of racial contact, including interracial dating. Uh, there's a lot more tolerance these days for obviously same-sex things, a lot of legalization of gay marriage, which I'm very happy for, right? And prejudice really has its roots in social systems. So prejudice, you can see prejudice from a lot of social inequalities, right? So people that have often developed attitudes that justify the status quo. People think that Donald Trump, because he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, which means he was the son of a rich person, that's how he was able to get into the business and make his money. And his belief, or a lot of people's belief, that people who were born into poverty, they're just too lazy. Um, no, the system is stacked against them, right? If you and I were going to have a race, and I say, okay, well, I get a head start of 20 yards in this 100-yard dash, you're going to say, wait, that's not fair. People that have the means to get things and do things and be able to start businesses because they have the capital to back it up gives them an advantage. They're starting 20, 30, 50 or more yards ahead in this race, right? That reminds me of another video that I'm going to post for you guys. So I'm glad that I thought of it. But the social inequalities have led to, they get everything fed to them, or they don't work enough, they're too lazy, or they should just make their situation better. Stop having babies and things like that, right? This idea of a just world phenomenon, that good is going to be rewarded, evil is punished a lot of times. And I'm not saying it's a negative thing, but religion sort of feeds into that. If you're good, you're going to get rewarded. And if you're down on your luck, if you're homeless and all of this, well, maybe you did something to land yourself there and your evil was punished. Maybe it's karma. And of course, we have our stereotypes, which try to rationalize these inequalities. Stereotypes tend to come from automatic thinking. Our brain, as we talked about in the last chapter of memory, likes to put things into categories. And it does so to ease your brain and to make it less busy so that you have time to think about other things and do other things. So if we just give in to stereotypes and don't find out for ourselves, right, that this certain race of people is said to be lazy, this certain race of people is said to be dirty, this certain race of people is said to be this or that, right? All we're doing is feeding into that. And if you think that way and your actions lead you that way, that's where these discriminations come in. This is where racism and sexism and all of this stuff comes in, right? If you stop and think about it, or actually professor. So of course, other professors and other psychologists are part of one of my groups. I'm a father, so other fathers and parents are another group that I identify with. Sports fans, group I identify with. My favorite band, other people that's their favorite band, I identify with them. That's part of a group. I'm a married man, so those that are married, maybe more than single, we have other things in common, right? So we call these that are in the groups that we're in, and there are very many ones that we can be part of, in groups. Um, and this is an evolutionary process. The evolution of human beings prepared us to be able to identify with certain groups. Could be the same haircut, same sports team, same another kid that goes to the same school as me. Those parents and I have something in common. So it's a social definition of who we are, and sometimes, a lot of times, who we are not. And it gives us an us versus them mentality. If I'm walking down the street, we talk about implicit bias. If I'm walking down the street and I see two complete strangers, one of them is wearing a Lakers jersey, one of them is wearing a Celtics jersey, which is, bitter rivals of the Lakers. All things being equal, not knowing anything about either of those people, I will tend to probably gravitate towards and say hi to somebody wearing a Laker jersey and not to the person wearing the Celtics jersey. Although for me, I try to say hi to both, even though I may have a certain, at least slight bias against the Celtics jersey, right? So we tend to favor our own. Um, People that have more in common with their bosses may get better treatment, and those that don't may get what they feel is unfair treatment, or at least less favorable treatment, right? So we always have these in-group versus out-groups, or an us versus them mentality. And even though we're usually not aware, again, it's an automatic process, we tend to favor those in our in-group, whichever in-group it is, especially if you have more than one with someone. We have outgroups. I was laughing to myself because I just remembered that I have a friend who I met when I went to San Francisco about 12 years ago. I went up there to see a concert for my favorite band, and I was sitting in a sports bar. It was like the first week of football season, and I'm a Dolphins fan, as I said. So I was watching a Dolphins game in a bar in San Francisco, and there was only one other person and his wife who were watching the same game as me. So at halftime, hey, this person is, I guess, part of my in-group because he's the only other one here watching the same game as me. So I went up to him and I said, hey, man, what's your name? He said, Brian. I was like, wow, I'm Bryant. And I was like, probably 30 at this point, maybe 30, maybe 29. So I was like, hey, man, how old are you? Same age as me, 29. And I was like, wow. And then I was like, oh, what are you doing here? And he's like, oh, I'm watching a game. I'm a Dolphins fan. I was like, what? Me too. So our names are similar. We're the same age. We're both Dolphins fans. And I was like, well, if I may ask, what are you doing in San Francisco? And he's like, oh, I'm here to see a Dave Matthews Band concert. And I was like, me too. I was like, did we just become best friends? Yup. Right? Right away. Same age, almost the same name, same favorite sports team, football team. He's also found out he was also a Laker fan. So both of our basketball and football teams were the same. And the more things we had in common, I was like, we are just destined to be good friends, right? It ended up being that he lived in Colorado. He still lives in Colorado, but we talk, and I'm in his fantasy football league. I don't know anybody else in the league other than him, except online. And so it just reminded me of that story, and I had a good chuckle. Some people think that, and we see this behavior, that there's a theory in its human nature, and we'll talk a little more about this in the next chapter for personality, that human nature, which has evolved over time, is that we are more likely to accept praise and deflect blame. If something goes right, we want to get the credit for it. If something goes wrong, we want to deflect it and say that it was on somebody else. Nobody does this more than the president. And you don't have to correct me because I'm not wrong. It's everybody else's fault if something goes wrong. It's never his. But if something good happens, it was all him. So this is part of what we call the scapegoat theory, that when things go wrong, if we find someone else to blame, it can provide an outlet for anger. When as we talked about in the memory chapter with flashbulb memory, when 9/11 happened, people were really discriminatory towards anybody from the Middle East. They didn't have to be Muslim or, part of the Osama bin Laden crew, right? There was a lot of prejudice against people. Now we see that, the president is calling this virus the Chinese virus, and people of Chinese descent, or not even Chinese, but Asian descent, have been targeted by people. This all goes as part of the scapegoat theory, right? If you find somebody to blame, there it is. And of course, the president says, oh, well, that's not me. I didn't say that. You just refused to stop calling it the Chinese virus, and you are putting people at risk, right? So evidence of the scapegoat theory is also more work done by Zimbardo, the Stanford prison experiment guy. And what he found in his research is that prejudice levels tend to be really high, especially among economically frustrated people. Um, it, it seems to be a double-edged sword because we see the very rich, the one percenters that say, oh, well, everybody else is not doing their part and blah, 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 blah. But we see this at the very low levels of poverty and economic frustration, right? In experiments, we can provide a temporary frustration. It doesn't have to be a lifelong one. And just a temporary one in an experimental setting increases people's prejudice. So we see this in the research. We see this in contrived experiments. The scapegoat theory is very, very real, and nobody does it more than the president. Um, so those are the sort of explicit prejudices. But of course, we have implicit biases as well, and that's the brainchild for your homework assignment, to go online and take one of these implicit tests. Could be weight, it could be gender, it could be sexuality, it could be race. You could take more than one if you really enjoy it. What these implicit tests mean is that even people who deny that they have any prejudice, I am very low on this prejudice. Do I love racial and sexist and all of these types of jokes because I get them? Yes. Do I share them with my friends? Sometimes, a lot of these memes and things like that. Um, and of course, my wife says, you know that that's sort of a racist thing when you do that. And I said, well, I'm sending them to people who feel the same way as me, that we would never discriminate or be racist or sexist or anything like that. But we find the humor in these things. And I tell her I'm equal opportunity. I find all of it funny, especially stuff that has to do with I grew up Jewish, so I love the Jewish jokes. I think they're hilarious, right? Does that make me racist? No. Does that mean I'm free of implicit biases? No, right? So we have um, something else that we call microaggressions, and you guys may have heard the term microaggressions. I don't have a specific definition in the slides, but microaggressions are basically backhanded compliments or little facial expressions or things that people don't even realize that they're doing, right? So you could think of it as this idea of unconscious patronization. Um, if you're Latinx, and I say, oh, well, maybe they're, I play into the stereotype that maybe people of center always really smart. So I should expect that Asian people are always going to get A's in my class. And if they don't, I'm disappointed. And as long as an African American or somebody like that gets a C, then okay, right? Sometimes you get inflated praise or insufficient criticism for minority student achievements. Um, you think of this as a co-ed softball team, a woman gets a hit, and you're like, oh, you did so well, you did so well. Um, that's not a cool thing, right? That's are your expectation if your expectations are lowered based on race or based on gender or things like that, then it's somewhat of an unconscious patronization, a microaggression sometimes. Backhanded compliments. We see this in race influenced perceptions and even reflexive body responses. It doesn't have to be verbal. It could be people that look kind of like the conformity study. You can see sometimes the cognitive dissonance in their head because whether it's people with white privilege that are expecting things to happen because they're white, or even if they don't realize it consciously, right? These are implicit biases. So again, part of this idea of stereotyping is that we automatically categorize. We categorize people by race. That black guy, that Mexican girl, that Asian person, right? When you're trying to explain what somebody looks like, um, we categorize people by race. That's one of the ways that we've always identified people. So remember, if we combine this with the idea of the fundamental attribution error and things like that, we are overestimating people's similarities when we categorize them. We're basically not looking at specific features, we're just putting them into an us versus them situation. And in this case, we have an overestimation. A lot of times you may hear something like what we call the other race effect or bias. You may say that there is actual scientific evidence that we do recognize specific features of our own race better than people of different races. And that might have been an evolutionary detail that the brain came up with to identify people that were in the same area or same tribe or something like that. Does that give us reason to be prejudiced or to be racist or to be explicitly discriminatory? Of course not. But let's look at a study that was done in 2011 where a person who was white, 100% Caucasian on the right, was mixed with a person who was 100% Chinese on the left. And you can see that there are different percentages. So second from the left is 80% Chinese with 20% of the Caucasian woman, 60-40 in the third one. The fourth one is 40-60. Then we have 20-80. So the second from the right is 80% of the Caucasian woman and 20% of Chinese. In this study in New Zealand, New Zealanders looked at these photos and they decided, or they classified of an Asian person may be more definable, right? So the shape of the eyes or the lips or things like that. So even though they would be defined as mixed, half white, half Chinese, in the middle, they were still classified more as Chinese. They weren't classified as mixed or anything like that. And only the two on the right were classified as Caucasian. The other four, the defining features, according to New Zealanders, was more of the Chinese than the white person. So the last thing that we're going to go over is looking at, when we talk about prejudice, when we talk about discrimination, a lot of times it's violent, right? So looking at aggression, we want to look at the biopsychosocial scale. With aggression, one of the things we see is people that are most likely to get in fights are males more than females, most likely to get arrested and put in jail, males much more than females, right? Likely to commit things like sexual assault, males more than females. And we can point to the biological nature, right? There's evidence from animal studies and evidence from twin studies that I like to point out. Remember, nature over nurture for me. Is that the genetic Y chromosome has more of the what's called the MAOA gene. And MAO is monoamine oxidase, which has to do with breaking down of neurotransmitters and things like that. That maybe some of these neurotransmitters are not broken down the same way that they are in females. We also know that alcohol tends to be consumed more by males than females, and alcohol, of course, is associated with aggressive responses to frustration. Women are much less likely to resort to violence when frustrated. Men are much more likely. Of course, when we look at neural influences, we also see more connectivity in the amygdala, the fear and rage center, in males than females. Neural systems can either facilitate or inhibit aggression when people are provoked. Some people get really overly aggressive and angry and need an outlet for it. Some people kind of just push it away, and they become even less um, aggressive in that case. We also know that people who have frontal lobe damage are more likely to use violence and be more aggressive. Of course, the biggest marker that we can point to is the male hormone testosterone, which is linked with a lot of things like irritability, assertiveness, impulsiveness, low tolerance for frustration. That's why if you combine alcohol with an overabundance of testosterone, a lot of times that's where you get the angry drunk that wants to fight. When we look at social, cultural, and psychological factors, right, we think of adversive events. So there's something called the frustration aggression principle, which says that frustration then starts to create anger, and anger, of course, can spark aggression. And so some people, they may have a short temper, so only one or two little things can really just get those aggressive juices flowing. For some people, it would have to take a lot more, right? We are all at individual levels. It could be testosterone, the amygdala, other influences, the MAOA gene. Um, all of these things, remember, we have to take together. We have the biological influences, we have the psychological influences of trauma and things like that, generalizability, discrimination, and of course, social cultural factors. Did you have parents that were very forceful on you? Did they model aggression at home, right? Like we talked about in the learning chapter. What other anger triggers are there? People who have hot tempers. Physical pain makes people more aggressive sometimes. If they're in pain, they want to take it out on other people or things. When you're insulted and you feel like your pride was hurt, your ego was hurt. Foul odors, cigarette smoke, crowding. There's a whole list of things. And I will tell you that I'm not an aggressive person by nature, but I am one of those jerks sometimes because I am really sensitive to cigarette smoke. So I'm one of those jerks, or I turn into one of those jerks that covers my face with my shirt. Well, now I'll have a mask anyway. So when people are smoking, and I'll deliberately pretend to cough uncomfortably around them, saying, "Hey, you're too close with that smoke." Um, and that's one of my biases. Um, am I proud of it? No. Do I regret it? No, because I don't want smoke anywhere near me or my family, especially my son. But I do get I don't get aggressive. I'm not going to start hitting people, but I do get a little forceful with my opinion when people are smoking near me. Like, oh, I can't believe it, right? Things like that. What other triggers are there? Previous reinforcement for aggressive behavior. We talked about that in observational learning, observing an aggressive role model, and of course, not having really good self-control, which also may be a sign of frontal lobe inhibition or damage. So the last thing really that we're going to talk about is, does this mean that with all of this idea of observational learning, psychological factors of aggression, that viewing violent media like TV shows, cartoons, right, video games, actually makes people do this? We talked about mimicry in society. We talked about following trends in society. Well, the media portrayals of violence provide a lot of social scripts that children do use when they follow. That's why the narrative is so bad sometimes when, if you've got a little boy, they've got to be blue, and girls have to be dressed in pink, and girls have to play with dolls, and boys have to play with trucks and swords and weapons, right? That just teaches them what scripts to follow, and a lot of times um, that's what they go by. I remember one time when Toys R Us was still a thing, we used to have one around the corner, and when Carter was 2, Dr. C, there was something that he wanted, and I don't remember. It would have been considered feminine or girly. I don't remember exactly what it was. Maybe it was an outfit or something like that. And my wife was like, "Sure, if he wants to wear that, if it's a dress or a costume, and he wants to be like a Disney princess, cool, because he's expressing himself." And there was a father with a son, probably about 6 years old, who just scoffed at my wife and I the fact that we would buy something like a dress for our son. And man, I was never prouder of my wife because she gave him a piece of her mind, and it was awesome. Like, how dare you? You know, we don't need to follow social scripts that boys only need to play with guns and girls only need to play with dolls, right? It's ridiculous. So, um, the media is at fault for that to a degree. Also, viewing sexual violence contributes towards greater aggression towards women. That might be true, right? We see it a lot in portrayals in a lot of these shows, CSI and FBI and stuff like that, in movies. And there's this belief that playing violent video games increases aggressive thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. We hear the narrative from Washington where they say guns don't, right? Guns don't kill people. It's the media that they see. And Walmart last year, as early as last year, they said, oh, this whole effect with all these school shootings and things going on, that they had the decision to stop selling firearms or stop selling violent video games. And guess what they chose? Lead Most studies show that that does not lead people to become violent. Just because you see a violent movie doesn't make you want to shoot people in your school, right? um, so that's the narrative the media gives a lot of times, and it's not the right one. It's not based on the research. So sure, you'll find some studies that show that a trend that it does lead to violent behaviors. And I'm not saying it's never led to it, but overwhelmingly, the research shows that it's not going to be the case most of the time. So, looking at the biopsychosocial scale, biological influences for aggression, genetics, testosterone, alcohol, neural influences like head injuries, looking at the psychological influences dominating behavior, which could boost testosterone levels, um, the sort of placebo effect with alcohol, suggestive effect, frustration, aggressive role models, being rewarded for aggressive behavior, and low amounts of self control. Social and cultural, de individuation, loss of self awareness and restraint, challenging factors such as crowding, heat, cigarette smoke, direct being directly provoked, parental models of aggression, so showing that your family deals with things by being aggressive. Sometimes we've heard things like minimal father involvement or being rejected from a group. A lot of times, students that shoot up schools will say, well, I was rejected by this person in a relationship or this group, and I didn't get to hang out with the cool kids, and so everybody's going to suffer. And again, questionable, but exposure to violent media, all of these things can play a role in the way that somebody acts if they're aggressive. I hope you guys enjoyed the social psychology chapter. I always love teaching this one, and it's no matter what time, what's going on in the world, what year we're in, it's always relevant. Social psychology and how we treat each other is always super relevant, and it gives me great pleasure to open everybody's eyes to it. Now, I know you guys already know a lot of this stuff because you can't go anywhere without seeing the divides in our country between people, belief systems, political beliefs, beliefs in science versus religion versus whatever. And it's just really interesting to look at a chapter like this at a time like this and just be able to reflect. I guess I'll give a plug for Psi Beta meeting. If you guys want to attend, I already know, you already know what it's about. If you can make it, great. If not, no worries. But until then, have a great rest of your day or evening, and I'll talk to you soon.